Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Alison Fernandes about cases of time travel and how knowledge constrains deliberation.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Alison Fernandes, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at Trinity College Dublin at the University of Dublin. Alison works on various issues in metaphysics, including time and causation. She's the author of a book called The Temporal Asymmetry of Causation, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023 as part of the Cambridge Elements series. And she's also got a paper that I'm going to go ahead and mention now because we'll talk about it a bunch in this episode today in Philosophical Studies from 2020 called Freedom, Self-Prediction, and the Possibility of Time Travel, which gets into issues of free will, but also time travel and some of the other issues in metaphysics that Alison's interested in. I'm excited to get to talk about that paper today. So welcome to the show, Alison. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to freedom or time travel?
Cool. Look, thank you for having me here as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, like other people, I came to philosophy partly through a different discipline. So I was on a kind of science track. I was interested in chemistry and especially physics. And this is going to be relevant to freedom because it's kind of how I got into it.
Yeah.
But one of my kind of important moments was it was actually classic German philosophy like Kant to Hegel, where I was like, oh, I think there's something right in this, in that even how we view the world scientifically partly depends on who we are as kind of people and agents and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so I was always interested in the kind of agential approach we take to the world, including sort of our ability to decide and do and intend and things like this.
Yeah.
And so when I was just starting my PhD at Columbia, I took a few classes with David Albert in philosophy of physics. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't even registered for these classes, as you said. Much to my surprise, even in doing this relatively foundational work in things like quantum mechanics and statistical mechanics, questions were coming up about how, what it was to be an intervener in the world. Mm-hmm. And especially, the dissertation project that I started around that time was thinking about, how do we get causal relations into our physical picture of the world, given that fundamental physical theories don't mention them? And I think the best answer to this question starts by talking about the freedom of agents. So basically, it's because we see ourselves as interveners in the world, ultimately as causal interveners, that we come to eventually view the world in causal terms. And we can't really understand a lot about causation or why causes come before their effects without thinking about the agential starting point. Mm-hmm. And so, from that point onwards, I was interested in coming up with models of free deliberation, thinking about what it takes both in physical and epistemic terms to have someone who's deliberating. And so it turned out that this question about, how to think about causation was kind of deeply tied to this other question of understanding human freedom. And rather than kind of causation coming first and directing how we think about the questions of free will, it was almost the other direction. Like you really had to get a grip on free will and understanding that before you develop a good account of causation.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a bit about time travel and free will in previous episodes, including our conversation with Kadri Viveland early on in the series, and more recently with Neil Tognazzini. And it seems like whenever we talk about time travel, we have to talk about the grandfather paradox. So could you summarize the grandfather paradox and how it's related to questions about free will?
Cool. Yeah, the grandfather paradox is always interesting for me. And it also comes in different forms. So I'm just going to lay out one classic form, which is primarily the way Lewis presented it. So, you hypothesize that time travel is possible. It is the kind of thing we could do. And then you think about a character typically named Tim, who in the story, he's grown up rich, but his family has their wealth due to his grandfather's munition works, where they made a lot of money in kind of dastardly ways. And Tim grows up with a kind of murderous intent of like, wouldn't it be good if he could take out his grandfather? But it turns out, his grandfather died before Tim was born. It seems like Tim can't do this. But in the story, Tim gets a time machine. He's able to travel back in time and confront his grandfather when his grandfather was a young man before he'd met, Tim's grandmother. And it seems, according to some of our intuitions, that Tim really should be able to kill his grandfather. But if he can do this and if he succeeds at doing this, well, then we seem to be caught in kind of a paradox or a set of inconsistent claims where if Tim succeeds in killing grandfather, grandfather dies, Tim's parents don't come to be born, Tim doesn't come to be born, and then there's no one to go back in time and kill grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
So the worry, as Lewis was phrasing it and that other people were worried about, was something like, look, what if the possibility of time travel implies these kind of inconsistencies and paradoxical situations? That would be a reason for thinking time travel wasn't possible after all. And we need some kind of limit due to metaphysics or physics that tells us that those kind of paradoxes are ruled out just because time travel is ruled out. And so it was kind of a serious threat to whether time travel was to be thought of as a coherent possibility at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, and as you mentioned, some people do see the grandfather paradox as a problem for the possibility of at least backward time travel. But many philosophers think that the paradox can be resolved. Your work summarizes a response to the paradox by David Lewis, who you mentioned, and many others accept his response to it or a modified version of it. Could you summarize and explain Lewis's response to the grandfather paradox?
Yeah, so Lewis's response, it comes in a way in kind of two parts. And again, it's because he's thinking about different versions of the paradox. But the first thing to say that Lewis says is, look, contradictions won't be true. If there's one thing that we're sure is going to happen, we're not going to have contradictions. So even if, Tim tries to kill his grandfather, something is going to get in the way. And not because of some kind of special force that comes into play, but just because of the way I told the story. I already told you that Tim comes to be alive and this is his grandfather. This implies that Tim won't succeed. So that's kind of the first sort of layer of response, is that at no point in telling this kind of concern do we have to commit to contradictions being true. That's kind of going way too far. But then the kind of more careful response that Lewis brings in, he says, look, part of what's going on and that makes the grandfather paradox confusing is we kind of feel pulled in two different directions. So it seems like Tim can kill his grandfather because he has all the kind of ordinary capabilities that humans have. He can be well trained, he can get a great rifle, he can line up his shot perfectly. Based on how we ordinarily think about what a person can do, it seems he can succeed at killing his grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if you accept what I and Lewis just said about, contradictions won't be true, he can't succeed in that sense. He's not going to make a contradiction true. And so there's going to be something that prevents him. So, is it the case that he can, or is it the case that he can't? And the solution to this version of the paradox, Lewis thinks, is to just distinguish two different senses of can. And on a neutral reading, you say, look, these are both different ways we could think about the freedom of agents. One in terms of something like an agent's local capacities and abilities, where we say, yeah, Tim can kill the person in front of him, why not? And another in which we think of Tim as a time-traveling agent who's come from the future, who has this particular history to himself.
Mm-hmm.
And if we use a can in that sense, well, it turns out Tim can't kill his grandfather. But Lewis's point is that in order to get some kind of new paradox or contradiction going, you have to try and use both senses of can at once. And again, the neutral responses say, look, just be careful about which sense of can you have in mind. And there's no contradiction here. It's true in one sense that Lewis can kill his grandfather. It's false in a different sense that he can kill his grandfather. But you're just not allowed to use both senses of can in a single sentence and claim that this proves that time travel is impossible.
Yeah. Well, your own response to the grandfather paradox differs from Lewis's. And the key to your response is what you call the ignorance condition on deliberation. Could you tell us what that condition is and why it's plausible?
Yeah, and look, I'll start with the lead-in for why, despite endorsing a lot of Lewis, I don't go with him all the way. And that is that Lewis gets a little bit tricksy at this point. And I always hesitate to kind of, criticize Lewis, but he is sometimes a kind of, a bit of a trickster. So everything I just said a moment ago about Lewis' response, I agree with. This is great. But then he goes on to say other things as well. And he says things like, look, using the ordinary sense of can, or, the sense of ability, which is the one we ought to be using, it turns out Tim can kill his grandfather. And he sort of thinks we're making some kind of fatalist mistake if we think there is a reasonable sense in which Tim can't kill his grandfather. He thinks, he goes through various reasons for this, but we're kind of like, as a fatalist kind of holds future facts fixed in the world and kind of says that we can't do stuff because the future is going to be a certain way. The thought is we're making a similar mistake in Tim's case and saying, look, just because we know that Tim will fail, we somehow think he can't succeed, and that's kind of some sort of mistake. So this is the bit that I was annoyed at in Lewis, and what led me to start with another kind of response, this sort of ignorance condition. So the thought here is that, look, we're not going like totally off the rails when we think there is a reasonable sense in which Tim can't kill his grandfather. And we think about, the ordinary ways in which we deliberate and what we take to be open to deliberation. If we already know something is the case, then it's typically not something that we take to be available for us to decide on one way or another. Mm-hmm. Especially a lot of things that we know about the past, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, we sort of hold those fixed in our deliberation. They're not things that are available to us to deliberate on. So based on that loose thought, I generated what I call this ignorance condition, which said, look, if you are genuinely practically certain, that is sort of certain for all practical intents and purposes, that something is or is not going to be the case, then it is not something that you can reasonably deliberate on. Mm-hmm. And, this kind of condition allows that you might sometimes be very irrational and sort of forget what you know and things like that. But just sort of, by and large, and for the most part, you're committing some kind of error if you already take something to be the case, you're already sure of it one way or the other, and yet you simultaneously deliberate about whether it is to be the case or not. And the thought is, in Tim's case, he really does have knowledge of the future of a kind that in the ordinary world, we normally only have the past. Tim really knows like where he's come from. He knows the kind of story of his grandfather's life. He knows all the reasons he has to travel back in time. So he arrives back in time with a vast store of evidence about the fact that his grandfather will survive. And so it's not some kind of irrational error if Tim takes grandfather's survival as something fixed in his deliberation. Mm-hmm. That is, in fact, a reasonable thing to do in this kind of case.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, now that we've seen how self-prediction or knowledge of what's sort of fixed can constrain deliberation, what are the implications for the grandfather paradox? Does this help to diffuse any of the arguments against the possibility of time travel?
I mean, yes and no, in the sense that in a way, this isn't doing too much additional work in diffusing what I take to be the main threat of the grandfather paradox. And that's because I kind of accept Lewis's initial response, which is say, look, as long as you distinguish different senses of what can be done, you're okay. There is a sense in which you can succeed. There is one which you can't succeed. As long as you don't try and make both can claims at once, you're okay. At the same time, I think there is, it does change our tendency to think about what's going on in the grandfather scenario and what, our experience of the world would be like if we did have something like time travel in play. So there's a sort of tendency in some of Lewis's and some of his, later writers following in his kind of footsteps. They sort of seem sometimes to act as if time travel wouldn't really change too much about how we ordinarily think about things like abilities and counterfactuals. Mm-hmm. And if things like the ignorance condition are right, I think actually because time travel starts to mess around with the kind of things you can be certain of and the kind of things you can know, it does start to mess around with how we should think about abilities and so forth. But this is the correct response, and it's the kind of messing around that we can accommodate. So it's kind of part of a defense of the possibility of time travel, but accepting that time travel might still be surprising in various ways and might lead us to have to rethink quite a few things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm wondering how the ignorance condition on deliberation would help to distinguish two kinds of time travel case. So you have the original case of Tim where he's sort of motivated by his own history and his knowledge of grandfather's survival and fathering his father and so forth to go back and actually kill him. What if he's got murderous intent, but he also, when he gets in the time machine, has amnesia, doesn't know that this guy that he's about to kill, he has murderous intent. Let's just suppose he's going to kill the first guy that he sees. It turns out it's his own grandfather. He doesn't know that this guy is going to live in the way that the original Tim did. Would you want to say in that case with the amnesia that he does have the ability to succeed in committing the murder, even though it's his own grandfather? So I'm wondering if his ignorance is constraining. I mean, he's not deliberating. Maybe he can deliberate about it in a way that the original Tim can't. But as far as sort of Lewis's own response to the grandfather paradox goes, it seems like this would pull you more in his direction, saying, yeah, there's no reason to say he can't do the thing in question.
Look, these are really good cases to think about. And my answer is going to be a little complicated because it does go in a way substantially beyond what's in that paper we were talking about. So the narrow thing that you were saying towards the end is sort of my first response, which is to say, what's going on with the ignorance condition is about when deliberation is reasonable. So in a new scenario where Tim has amnesia, it's not surprising that new deliberative possibilities are available to him precisely because his beliefs have changed. And that, that shouldn't be too surprising if his freedom of deliberation in that sense, what is reason to deliberate on changes. But then you've fairly raised like a more general question, which is something like, well, how do we think about abilities to act more generally in these kind of cases? And should they be tied quite narrowly to what beliefs we have and what's open to us epistemically, or are they more about something else? And as with counterfactuals and a few other things that are in play in these discussions, I kind of think abilities can be thought about in different ways, and it's probably going to be quite context dependent. So, there's nothing wrong with having a more, how can I put it, a sense of ability that is more tied to a person's physical history and their causal origins, for example. And in that case, we would say, look, even though Tim has amnesia, because he has the same causal inputs to his life, it's reasonable when we think about his abilities that we hold that stuff fixed. And part of the reason for that is that, absent this unusual amnesia, it would be stuff that he was typically be certain of in a certain kind of way. But at the same time, I also think it's reasonable to say, well, look, maybe sometimes we also want to tie someone's abilities more closely to what their epistemic possibilities are and what they can deliberate on. And then you say, well, no, it's not really possible for Tim to sort of, and you might say, look, intentionally kill his grandfather or bring in some kind of that language to sort of emphasize the fact that it might happen accidentally here, but it's not going to be the kind of thing that Tim can reasonably plan for and kind of arrange the world to bring about. At best, it would be kind of an accident.
Suppose that Tim, maybe this is a case against him being rational. Suppose that he believes that his grandfather lived and sired his father, but he also believes, well, maybe it's possible that I can make a contradiction come true. In that case, I guess he's not completely rational, but what do we say about the ignorance condition on deliberation in that kind of case?
Yeah, no, equally, I love these cases as well. So there's kind of a whole host of ways in which Tim might accept both the fact that his grandfather lived, but still think it's kind of possible for him to kill his grandfather. And, it might be, he thinks contradictions might be true. It might be he's not sure about the metaphysics of time travel. Maybe he thinks there might be multiple timelines, that identity. There's all sorts of, funky things that I'm not sure about, and reasonably so. So strictly in these cases, if Tim, the way I would normally fix it is Tim certain, or practically certain, if you like, that his grandfather will survive? And the way, if we think contradictions can be true, it sounds like the answer then is no, because the fact that he survives doesn't rule out the fact that he's going to not survive. And so at least in that kind of sense, it's not, let's be kind to myself today and say, look, it's not the kind of practical certainty that most of us have in mind there. And so, Tim is now free to deliberate. And the ignorance condition, it still holds, but just doesn't play in this case because Tim has the kind of ignorance that allows him to deliberate. And, in other kinds of cases, it becomes even clearer that, Tim is just appropriately ignorant, deliberation is fine for him. And, and as with the amnesia case, but kind of the opposite way around, as we start kind of playing around with how an agent responds to their evidence, according to the ignorance condition I defend, it really is the beliefs that the agent happened to have that mostly constrict their ability to rationally deliberate. And that part of the equation, it doesn't really matter where the beliefs come from, whether they're rational or irrational, or respond to kind of weird amnesia or anything like that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, why I find these cases interesting is, yes, we have to think about these abnormal cases where funky stuff is going on with someone's belief-forming practices. But we can also think about the non-funky case and assume something like evidential rationality, where we respond appropriately to our evidence and, don't entertain the possibility of true contradictions and, don't throw up our sense of metaphysics and things like that.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm interested in that kind of epistemically rational case is that, we do have situations where it's not due to the fault of some agent that they become sure of what they're going to do. It's precisely because they're being appropriately responsive to their evidence that they're sure. And so, I'm kind of interested both in the ignorance condition by itself, but also what happens when you conjoin it to us being evidentially irrational. That's when you get the kind of interesting upshots in the time travel case. So it's true you get different upshots when you take away that evidential rationality, and start messing around with the beliefs that the agent does or doesn't have. But I think the kind of wider implications of thinking about things like abilities and counterfactuals are kind of more convincing when you combine the ignorance condition with being evidentially rational as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Well, what are some of the main objections to the ignorance condition on deliberation, and how do you address them?
Yeah, also always fun to hear about objections. I think these come in different flavors. So for people who find the ignorance condition compelling, it's often because they're thinking about deliberation as a kind of having a cognitive function almost. Like it's helping us fix what is going to happen so we can engage in further planning. So it takes us from a state of being uncertain to being a state of being certain about what we're going to do, and then we can kind of make further plans from there. And so one of the objections to the ignorance condition is to say, look, what if deliberation is not about fixing certainty, but is instead about something like making good or the right decisions or the rational decisions? And the thought is, look, even if you're certain that you're going to say choose irrationally, that doesn't remove the requirement on you to choose rationally. And so you should be still deliberating even in this scenario, because you should be choosing the correct good choice, even if you're uncertain. Sorry, even if you're certain that you're going to choose, say, the bad choice.
Yeah.
So that's one kind of objection. And I'm sympathetic here, and I don't think you have to argue that everything we do in life serves one and only one function. But for me, part of the pushback is to say, look, it's not that we can, never have a situation where, maybe I assume I'm going to choose the bad choice and I give up too soon, when really I could have made the good choice because I really wasn't sure that it was going to be, that it was ruled out or something like that. So there are going to be cases like that. But if we imagine cases where we systematically engage in deliberation on things that we don't believe will happen, and we're evidentially rational and sort of form our beliefs based off good evidence, then we are going to have a situation where we're running around spending a lot of time thinking about these so-called good options that we never actually choose. And the thought is, this is still irrational. There might be something good we're doing in still deliberating on these good choices, that we are still failing something in what it is to be an effective human agent if we're wasting our time like this. So that's one kind of response. And for all these objections, I'm sympathetic to the objections. So it's just a bit of sort of light pushback. The other kind of objection that I get that I'll briefly talk about is one that thinks very much in terms of, agents just have their kind of built-in freedom and abilities to act in certain ways.
Yeah.
And what their beliefs happen to be about is sort of irrelevant to this question. It's a little bit like the stories we were talking about earlier, where, Tim, the time traveler, just has the things he can and can't do. And you can mess around with whether he has the beliefs or not. It shouldn't change his kind of physical abilities. And I think this is a very kind of compelling intuition, because we do think about, especially agents, but also other things in the world, as just having their kind of abilities almost kind of intrinsic to themselves. You don't have to think about things like what their beliefs are about in order to think about what the abilities are. So it's a kind of intuition I understand, but I do think that thinking carefully about cases of causation and time travel should lead us to question this picture that we do have any sense of what the abilities of something are independently of its surrounds. So there's sort of something like our thinking about abilities is very bound up with how we think about causation. And none of how we think about causation is about what an object has just internal to itself. It's all about how it relates in a law-like way to other things going on. And that always requires thinking about the environment in which it's embedded and how we should, as we'll go down to, do things like evaluate counterfactuals and think about how changes here correlate with changes elsewhere. And so the simple picture that thinks of agents as coming just with built-in abilities that we can make sense of by themselves, no, we should be giving that up anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a compelling response to that objection. I mean, even like in the free will literature, when people are giving an account of what it is to be sensitive to reasons, agents' beliefs and how they're disposed to respond in various environments play a role in kind of specifying whether they even have a certain kind of freedom. So I think that's a kind of plausible picture. It's not just some very limited set of intrinsic properties that gives the agent their freedom.
Yeah, I agree. Especially because we're talking about agency, and we are meant to take in information from the environment and use that with other things to direct how we behave. The idea that you could just demarcate how all that went without consideration of what's around us, very strange.
Well, your paper focuses on the case of time travel that's at issue in the grandfather paradox, but you also argue that there are implications of the ignorance condition on deliberation that are more far-reaching. So one of the other implications that you discuss concerns the apparent openness of the future, and I want to ask about that one. Can you tell us a bit about how the ignorance condition relates to our conception of the future?
Cool. Yeah, so this comes from a background where the way the laws of nature operate, for example, doesn't really have a time direction built in. And so there's a kind of puzzle about why, in general, we think of the future as open as the past is fixed.
Right.
And this is probably tied to causation, but for reasons I was talking about earlier, because we need to make sense of freedom before we make sense of causation. So we don't want to just say, the future is causally open. Why is that? But if you add agents to the picture and the ignorance condition, you get at least the start of an answer to this. So for broadly physical reasons, we think there is a temporal asymmetry in the way objects can acquire knowledge and beliefs about the world. So it's not just a kind of quirk of humanity that we remember the past and not the future. It's due to very deep features of the way animals and things in general can respond to their environment. So, we do form memories of the past and not the future. And based on this huge store of very particular and precise information that we can develop about the past that's kind of related to us and otherwise might be under our control can't be under our control given the ignorance condition. A lot of the recent past that otherwise I might take to be correlated with what I do now, it's not even a potential for deliberation if the ignorance condition is true. And so broadly, insofar as we're thinking about the past as being something like epistemically fixed, something that we believe to be a certain way independently of what we do now, it's not going to be the kind of thing that we can take to be open to deliberation. But, towards the future, the story is entirely different. Well, we can make predictions about what's going to happen in the future, so we have some beliefs about that. Typically, it's about things that are going to be the way they are independently of what we do or decide. And so, I know there's lots of different ways to tell these parts of the story, but yeah, in broad brushstrokes, it's because we are so epistemically uncertain about the future that at least it's a potential realm for things like deliberation, whereas towards the past, it's quite different. And this, again, I'm sort of aware of all the kind of nuances you can get into here, but at least very generally, many people in this working in this area think there's some kind of link between the way we have knowledge about the past and the fact that we control the future, and the fact that these asymmetries are deeply tied together.
Another implication of the ignorance condition that you discuss concerns counterfactuals. So how does the condition bear on how we should evaluate them?
Yeah, so counterfactuals are interesting. And when I talk about counterfactuals, I often find myself using this language of what is open and fixed. But I find it very intuitive, but not everyone does. So I'll just briefly explain what's going on with that. So if we think about a counterfactual, like, if I were to do this here, this would be the case. Typically, we need something like a recipe or a method of evaluating what is going to be the case in this kind of quote unquote counterfactual world where something is different and say in the present, the antecedent is different. And one way of thinking about what those recipes do is they tell us, look, here are ways in which this counterfactual world should be similar to or like or the same as the actual world. And I'm going to call that keeping things fixed. And at the same time, these methods might also say, but don't hold these other things fixed. Don't assume these other things are going to stay the same. So typically the way we think about counterfactuals is if we change something in the present, we often think that most of the past would probably be the same, maybe only some slight differences leading up to the world being different at that antecedent, but that the future might be very different. So, if I were to drink a glass of water now, maybe there'd have to at least be a full glass of water before me on the desk. And it might, lead my body to be differently saturated with water, and I might go pee at a different time, all sorts of things. But we wouldn't have to change much about the past. That's a typical way of doing it.
Right.
But if this is how we think about counterfactuals in general, we're going to have a lot of problems when it comes to certain cases, one of the main ones being time travel cases. One way of thinking about what's going on in time travel scenarios is that we are just messing with that whole simple distinction I was just making between the past and the future. You now have, bits of the past that are sort of in the future of other bits, and it gets, entangled and messy. Basically, there are no longer kind of global ways of assigning events to past, present, and future. And so in these kind of scenarios, you need something more nuanced, a sort of different recipe for saying what to hold fixed that isn't, the entire past. Because if you do that, arguably you can't even get time travel scenarios going, because you can't have someone's appearance in the past in a time machine depending on their entering the time machine in the present, which you sort of want to do. All of which is to say, if you have this kind of ignorance condition in play, it gives you a different recipe about what to hold fixed. It says, for example, hold fixed things that, one idea, hold fixed things that the agent is certain of. Slightly broader idea, hold fixed things that they have kind of reasonable evidential access to. Third idea, hold fixed things that are causally upstream. That is, tracking evidence back in a causal fashion. Okay. Right. So based on the ignorance condition, these are kind of three ways you can kind of find out what you hold fixed that will hold some parts of scenarios fixed in time travel scenarios, but not the entire global time slice at once. So these are kind of local ways of figuring out what to hold fixed. And as far as I can tell, these kind of local things are absolutely required for time travel scenarios. And the ignorance condition is an excellent way of kind of motivating why this kind of local thing makes sense. Because if, tying it more broadly, why do we care about counterfactuals? So one of the arguments is that we care about them as agents because they do help us keep track of things we can influence or ways in which things depend on other things evidentially. And if we have something that we already know to be the case, it often makes sense for us to hold that part fixed while keeping other things open in our deliberation. And so, I wrote a few more papers on time travel arguing about this stuff. And, one of them was even arguing that, like, even you can't even hold other aspects of the global present fixed when you evaluate counterfactuals in time travel scenarios. You really have to allow that what I do in one part of the timeline may affect things happening simultaneously, global distant places.
Yeah.
But if you have this nice local-based method that's supported by this ignorance condition, you can get reasonable counterfactuals coming out in these kind of cases, whereas a lot of the ways that we use to evaluate counterfactuals in the actual world when we rule out time travel just won't work here. And at least my instinct is that if you want to be using counterfactuals to explain things in the actual world, for example, to explain the temporal asymmetry of causation, you can't just help yourself to a method that only works when there is a global temporal asymmetry in play. You have to use some kind of general neutral method that can work for more general kind of cases. Otherwise, the method sort of smuggles in far too much about the temporal structure, whereas the whole point usually is to explain how the temporal structure gets you these global temporal asymmetries, not just assume them from the start.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Alison. This has been very fun and love hearing about your work. If listeners want to read something or follow your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, so there's a couple of places. So I do have a general professional website. It's just alisonfernandes.net. There aren't many Alison Fernandeses around, so it's easy to find. And I'm usually posting, there's abstracts of my work and drafts and preprints if I have them. At the moment, it's a bit quiet because I have a book project underway, but books take a while to write.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have one I completed earlier, which would be my recommendation if someone wants to have a read of my work. It's called The Temporal Asymmetry of Causation. It's a Cambridge Elements series. And, I'm not sure everyone thinks that the core puzzle we face as philosophers is understanding why causes come before their effects. But I think it might be, and so the book is partly a defense of this puzzle and why it's important. And then it gives a relatively neutral characterization of these different approaches. And one of the things that's nice about this puzzle is that it's one of these areas of philosophy where some of the science and physics comes into play, but then these considerations of agency that we've been getting into today are also just as much in play. And a lot of the back and forth at the moment is exactly how to kind of balance and kind of entwine all this. But it's an area where I think there's progress being made and where we might actually see, relatively well agreed upon solutions coming out even in the next few years. So it's an exciting area.
Nice.
Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah, thanks again.
No worries. Thank you, guys.
In the next episode, we'll talk about non-basic action with Michaela Kelly, Neubauer Family Assistant Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Chicago.